Again, this is some of the new video coming out from the New Orleans attack. This is courtesy Crystal, which is over in that area. This is one of the cameras that was pointed at a crowd that essentially ran for their life as that truck did speed by. Now, investigators say the rented truck that was used by that New Orleans attacker had an ISIS flag on it, and essentially that the suspect had been radicalized, so to speak, by ISIS. A lot to discuss on that topic, so I do want to bring in Admiral Robert Moret, a professor of practice at Syracuse University. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us today.
Morning, Josh. Good to be back with you.
And I do want to ask you, because so many of us over the years have heard about ISIS, but I wanted to see if you can give me kind of a breakdown of the terror group and who they are, where they're located for folks out there who only know kind of bits and pieces of that.
Josh, ISIS first, this manifestation of a radical extremist group really came out on the map about 10 years ago in Iraq and Syria, and they were very, very successful, if you want to put it in those terms, at commanding a large swath of territory across Iraq and Syria, which they controlled for many years, and had a pretty robust organization, thousands of fighters underneath their control. And there was a conflict that probably should have gotten more attention between 2015 and 2019, in which the Iraqi military and our Kurdish allies in Syria and U.S. forces came together and basically eradicated the group and all the territory they had. There's still some bits and pieces remaining, which we're contesting under a coalition operation called Operation Inherent Resolve. But they're very, very much scattered today, although they do have a global impact on the web and through influence that they're trying to continue throughout the present day.
And there are people that are radicalized, so to speak, by ISIS just about everywhere. I imagine that includes in the U.S. here.
You know, one of the ways that we tend to look at these things, and I mentioned two things, Josh. We tend to look at domestic implications and potential violent extremists that we have in our own country, but also the international piece and what the interface looks like between the two of them. But pertaining to ISIS, you know, and as I think I mentioned before, we tend to divide extremist groups into three categories. And the first category is the core group, in this case, ISIS, which is largely still trying to have some kind of a geographic imperative in Syria and Iraq, which is pretty limited. The second, what we call the affiliates. And ISIS does have several affiliates in like the AFPAC region, and it's called ISIS-K. Others in the Maghreb and Africa, and some in Somalia. And the third group that the attack that we had in New Orleans falls into is what we call the like-mindeds. And these are people that don't have any connection or connective tissue to the parent organization, but kind of share their goals, if you want to call it that, and act independently, but don't have any connection at all with the core group.
Digging a little bit deeper into what you were just talking about there, I wanted to know, do you see people who essentially, when you're talking about Americans specifically, that are seeking out ISIS to join, or do Americans get sought by the terrorist group? Is it a mix of both? What can you tell me about what you know about that?
It's kind of a push-pull, I would say. I mean, the scattered, and this is largely in social media and on the web, you know, influence that ISIS tries to exert across nations, including the United States and so many other places through the present day, does try to recruit, so to speak, people who share their goals, their perverted goals. But at the same time, a lot of times people reach out to them because of desperation and other circumstances. And keeping track of them in any country, to include the United States, which is largely at the federal level, an FBI mission, is really, really difficult.
When investigators came out and said, I mean, a lot of folks had pointed it out in the image of the truck that there was the ISIS flag, but investigators coming out and saying this was an ISIS flag, what goes through your mind at that point? What are you thinking when you initially hear that there is that flag on the rented truck?
If there's, you know, some connection between what he was trying to do, and he viewed himself, for whatever reason, as somebody who was a representative of ISIS, which again is not to say that the ISIS leadership had any knowledge of this at all or any connection with it. That doesn't make any difference. And the fact that there's just trying to keep track of individuals like this who are completely independent actors and ones that take it upon themselves to wrap themselves in a flag of any terrorist extremist group is a tough mission and one that is very important on the list.
Does federal law enforcement spend a maybe significant amount of time looking, combing over, let's say, the internet and social media, looking for people who might be linked to ISIS when you're talking about Americans who maybe are reaching out to the terrorist group or really any terrorist group in general?
Since the 9/11 attacks, we've made a lot of progress in terms of how that's organized. And just briefly, I would say, the Terrorist Screening Center, which is part of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, but also separate databases that are shared with them by the NCTC, the National Counterterrorism Center, which is part of the Director of National Intelligence. Those two organizations have the overseas component, but also the domestic component of trying to keep track of violent extremists that we have here in the United States and how they interact with anything internationally. Having said that, I'm pretty sympathetic to not just the federal, that is the FBI, but also state and local law enforcement, because you have to make a distinction between people that just, spout off a lot of nonsense about, potential affiliation with radical extremist groups, but are, tame or don't plan to do anything, and others that are truly dangerous that we need to bring to the attention of law enforcement authorities as soon as we find out anything along those lines.
I'm hoping you can provide some insight on this. It's something that I've been curious about. Can you explain the terror watch list? We're told the New Orleans attacker was not on it. So what is that list? How is it compiled? And I imagine it's something the public does not have access to, and it's fairly classified.
So some of the material is very highly classified. Some of it isn't classified at all, quite frankly, in terms of domestic things. But the short answer, without getting into too much government alphabet soup on you and the people we have watching us today, Josh, is the Terrorist Screening Center has what's called the Terrorist Screening Database, which is maintained by the Federal Bureau of Investigation and shared with state and local law enforcement as it needs to be. And there's also, as I mentioned, the international piece of that, which is probably more highly classified at the National Counterterrorism Center, the NCTC, which has responsibility for looking at anything overseas that may pertain to the United States, which they work closely with law enforcement here in the United States on. That one is fairly highly classified because of the sources and methods that you have to use to see what's going on overseas that might have implications with attacks here in the United States.
This may be a difficult question because it could be kind of person by person. But if you, let's say, know somebody, you have a family member who you believe could be trying to reach out to a terrorist organization, could actually be part of a terrorist organization like ISIS, what are you supposed to do? Should you just call the FBI? Should you call someone and let them know?
Say notify law enforcement as soon as you can. And that's a really important thing. If you see something, say something. How you do that, I think, depends upon, it's situationally dependent. It may just pertain to local law enforcement or state or federal. But if you do have real concerns about any individual that you know, whether it's a family member, an acquaintance, or anything along those lines, or if you see something that looks truly dangerous, you do have to notify law enforcement. And that's a responsibility that all of us have here in the U.S.
All right. Robert Moret, thank you so much, as always, for taking the time to join us and help break down a developing situation. There's so many questions as we keep hearing about ISIS, so I'm glad you were able to join us to talk more about that. Anything else you want to add before I let you go?
One point I might make, Josh, is one of the things that we do have to be concerned about from an international standpoint in any kind of threats like this is most of them come from what we described as ungoverned or semi-governed areas. And, Syria continues to be one of those now. But a lot of the bad actors that seek to mount attacks here in the United States do have some geographic nexus someplace overseas. And one of the international security things that we have to keep an eye on is making sure that we eliminate those as much as we possibly can, as we were successful in doing against ISIS in Syria and Iraq. And that's a mission that's going to be with us for many years into the future.
All right. Thank you again for taking the time to be with us here this morning. We appreciate it.
Good to see you, Josh. Best wishes.